Every empire has the same blind spot. They think no one can beat them. That's cute. In this video, 10 tiny armies pull off the kind of humiliations that generals don't put in their memoirs. Spoiler alert, size really didn't matter. David versus Darius. The Persian Empire was on a roll. It swallowed cities, crushed rebellions, and expected everyone to fall in line. In 490 BCE, King Darius sent 25,000 men across the Aegean to do one thing: punish Athens for helping rebels in Ionia. The message was simple: kneel or burn. Athens didn't kneel, it didn't even wait. Outnumbered 2-1, the Athenians called on every free man who could hold a spear. About 10,000 hoplites, farmers, craftsmen, maybe a few guys who'd never killed anything bigger than a chicken, marched to Marathon. They camped for days, staring down the Persian army across the plain. The Persians waited. They assumed the Greeks would break first, but Miltiades, the Athenian general, had other plans. He knew Persian cavalry had wandered off. No horses meant no surprise charge, so he told his men to move. They didn't walk, they ran. Half a mile across the field, in heavy armor, straight at archers who expected a slow approach. It was one of the first recorded full-speed battlefield charges in history. The Persians, caught off guard, broke formation. Arrows flew, but the Greeks smashed into the center like a bronze fist. It wasn't even close. The Persians lost about 6,400 men. The Athenians? Just 192. That's not a typo. Darius had the numbers, the ships, the fame. Athens had sandals, shields, and no patience for being conquered. The Persians retreated, and Athens got bragging rights for the next 2,500 years. Oh, and that famous 26.2-mile run? That comes from a soldier named Phidippides, who supposedly ran from Marathon to Athens to announce the win, then dropped dead from exhaustion. That part's debated, but the win wasn't. One of the biggest empires in the world got clobbered by some sweaty Greeks with attitude problems. Turns out, the best way to stop an invasion is to sprint at it and hit it in the face. Next time, Persia might want to pack more than confidence. Scots versus English might at Bannockburn. Edward II of England wanted Scotland back under control. The Scots had been rebelling for years, and he was tired of it. So he brought an army, around 15,000 strong, loaded with knights, archers, and armored muscle. Across the field, Robert the Bruce with maybe 6,000 men, most on foot. The location? Bannockburn, just outside Stirling. The Scots didn't have fancy armor or massive cavalry charges. What they had was mud, a narrow battlefield, and sharp sticks. Literally. They formed tight lines of spearmen called skiltrons. Think spiky hedgehogs that didn't move unless you got too close. The English knights charged anyway. It was a disaster. The terrain was a mess. The ground was soft, the path was tight, and horses kept getting stuck or funneled into dead zones. Once trapped, they were easy targets. The Scots jabbed at anything that moved. Even the English archers couldn't get a clean shot because their own men were blocking the view. And Bruce? He stayed cool. This is the same guy who once killed an English knight in single combat with a battle axe, mid-battle, in front of everyone. He wasn't just leading, he was daring them to keep coming. By the second day, the English army was boxed in, crushed, and forced to run. Many drowned trying to escape across a river. Thousands died. Edward himself fled the field, barely escaping with his life. Scotland didn't win independence on that day alone, but Bannockburn was the turning point. A small, gritty army had humiliated a king with twice their numbers and all the gear. It wasn't luck. It was positioning, planning, and just enough rage to hold the line. The English came expecting surrender. They left covered in mud, missing horses, and short on pride. Bannockburn didn't just change the war. It made sure no one forgot what happened when a giant charged blind into a spike wall. If you're going to invade Scotland, pack a map, some humility, and maybe skip the plate armor. Swiss peasants versus the Habsburg Knights. In 1315, Duke Leopold of Austria rode into Switzerland with an army of elite knights and full confidence. The Swiss peasants, he figured, would do what peasants usually did: submit, pay taxes, and keep quiet. Instead, they grabbed halberds and climbed the nearest hill. Leopold planned a surprise march through a narrow mountain pass near Lake Egerri to catch the Swiss off guard. But the Swiss weren't asleep. They had spies, scouts, and a perfect view of the terrain. About 1,500 men waited above the trail near Morgarten. No armor, no cavalry, no training, just rage and a plan. As the knights marched into the pass, the Swiss dropped logs and boulders onto the front line. Horses crashed into each other. Soldiers tumbled into the frozen lake. Then came the charge. The Swiss swarmed down the hillside, swinging halberds, axes, and anything else with a sharp edge. They didn't move in neat ranks. There was no trumpet or banner. It was a roar of fury and blunt force. Some Swiss fighters wore padded tunics stuffed with straw. Others just wore whatever they had at home. This wasn't a trained army. It was an avalanche of locals who had spent years watching tax collectors and foreign troops walk through their villages like they owned them. The knights were packed too tightly to fight back. Their armor worked against them. They couldn't move. Some suffocated under piles of bodies. Others drowned trying to escape. Hundreds died within minutes. The rest fled in chaos. It wasn't just a battlefield loss. It was total humiliation. The Habsburg army, one of Europe's best, had been wrecked by people who'd spent the previous week herding goats. One survivor later described the scene as a slaughterhouse without walls. The Habsburgs expected fear. What they got was fury aimed downhill. Morgarten wasn't just a tactical loss. It shattered the myth of noble superiority. The Swiss didn't chase territory. They just wanted to be left alone. But after Morgarten, they realized they had something bigger: independence. Other cantons joined the Confederation. The idea of a united, free Switzerland started to take shape. Leopold didn't try again, not for a long time. His knights went home and stopped bragging about invincibility. Morgarten sent a clear message: don't assume victory just because you brought a horse. Turns out, heavy armor and noble titles don't mean much when you're face down in a mountain ditch. Vietnam's farmers versus the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty thought it could turn Vietnam into a southern province. They installed governors, took resources, and banned native customs. It looked like a done deal, but in 1418, Lalor picked up a sword and said no. He wasn't from a royal line. He wasn't trained in military tactics. He was a wealthy landowner from Thanh Hoa province, tired of watching his people suffer under foreign rule. He started small, rallying farmers, hunters, and displaced nobles. They had few weapons and less armor, but they knew the land, and they knew who the enemy was. Early battles were a mess. Victories were rare. Lalor and his men lived in caves, forests, and swamps. Some of them didn't even have shoes. But the longer they held out, the more support they gained. Peasants started to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't suicide. Maybe they could actually win. The strategy wasn't to fight like an empire. Lalor's forces avoided direct battles. They struck supply lines, torched outposts, and disappeared into the jungle. They forged documents to confuse enemy commanders. In one famous case, they sent fake orders to a Ming garrison, causing them to retreat without a fight. The Ming responded by sending over 100,000 troops into Vietnam. That made things worse. Their soldiers got sick, lost in the forest, and overwhelmed by small bands of rebels who attacked at night and vanished by morning. Lalor kept building support. Villagers fed his troops. Local scholars helped with propaganda. Even women took part, relaying messages and hiding fighters. By 1426, the Ming were bleeding resources with no end in sight. The final blow came at the Battle of Tot Duong, Chuk Duong. Vietnamese forces ambushed and destroyed thousands of Ming troops. It wasn't even close. Ming generals started begging for reinforcements. Back in China, the emperor realized they were throwing men into a meat grinder and getting nothing back. Even Chinese historians later called it one of the costliest foreign campaigns in Ming history. In 1427, the Ming surrendered and withdrew. Lalor became emperor. Vietnam was finally independent. It wasn't a glorious cavalry charge or a dramatic last stand. It was a long, grinding fight, led by locals with no formal army and no reason to quit. They didn't just resist. They wore down a superpower and made it walk. Sometimes, all it takes to beat an empire is patience, trees, and a very stubborn population. Ethiopians versus Italy's colonial dream. Italy wanted a slice of Africa, and Ethiopia looked like an easy grab. In the 1890s, the Italians had already set up shop in nearby Eritrea. They figured Ethiopia would fold like the rest. What they didn't count on was Emperor Menelik II, a sharp ruler who read treaties carefully and stocked up on guns while pretending to negotiate. When Italy claimed Ethiopia as a protectorate in 1890, Menelik called it nonsense. He built alliances with other local leaders, imported over 100,000 rifles from Russia and France, and waited. Italy, confident in its modern army, marched in with 17,000 troops. On March 1, 1896, they met 100,000 Ethiopian soldiers at the Battle of Adwa. The Italians assumed their tech and training would win the day. They split their forces across rough mountain terrain without proper coordination. Bad idea. Menelik's troops knew the landscape, moved fast, and hit every split Italian unit at once. It was a complete disaster. Over 7,000 Italians were killed. Another 3,000 were taken prisoner. Ethiopia lost soldiers too, but they kept the battlefield. Menelik didn't just win the fight. He forced Italy to sign a treaty recognizing Ethiopia as an independent state. This wasn't just an underdog victory. It shattered European assumptions. Ethiopia became the first African nation to defeat a modern European army in a full-scale war. While the rest of the continent got carved up, Ethiopia stayed free. Back in Italy, the loss sparked riots. Politicians resigned. National pride took a nosedive. Meanwhile, Menelik returned to Addis Ababa as a national hero, with prisoners of war and captured artillery in tow. Adwa wasn't luck. It was planning, patience, and knowing exactly when to stop pretending to play nice. The Italians came to write history. The Ethiopians sent them home with a pen and a correction. Zulus versus the British at Isandlwana. In 1879, the British Empire was deep in its conquer-everything phase. South Africa was next. The Zulu kingdom stood in the way. London figured the war would take a few weeks. After all, how could spear-wielding warriors defeat rifles and artillery? They found out on January 22, at the Battle of Isandlwana. British forces had marched into Zululand without proper supply lines or scouting. Colonel Durnford and Lieutenant Colonel Pulline were in charge of about 1,800 British and colonial troops. Most of them camped out with tents, gear scattered across the hillside, and no defensive perimeter. Classic mistake. About 20,000 Zulu warriors advanced under Chief Nachingweo. They used a formation known as the Horns of the Buffalo. A central force pushed forward while flanks curled around to surround and trap the enemy. The British didn't see it coming until it was far too late. By the time they realized the scale of the attack, it was chaos. Zulu fighters closed the distance fast. British soldiers fired volleys, but the ammo supply system broke down. Boxes were sealed with screws, and quartermasters hesitated. Minutes mattered. The Zulus broke through. Within hours, the camp was overrun. Some tried to run. Most didn't make it. Around 1,300 British and Allied soldiers died. The Zulus lost about 1,000, but they held the field. This wasn't some desperate surprise attack. It was a well-organized assault, led by a kingdom with strict discipline and solid tactics. The Zulus didn't just win. They annihilated a force that believed it was untouchable. News of the defeat shocked Britain. Parliament went into damage control. The press called it the worst disaster since the Crimean War. Back in South Africa, the British scrambled to regroup, eventually overwhelming the Zulus, but not before Isandlwana carved a permanent scar into imperial pride. The empire thought it brought order. Instead, it met a shield wall and a war cry. The Redcoats came with confidence. The Zulus sent them home with silence. Haitian rebels versus Napoleon's army. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte was done playing nice. The Haitian Revolution had been burning for over a decade, and he wanted it stamped out fast. He sent 40,000 troops, his brother-in-law included, to take back control. These were elite French soldiers, the best of the best. You know what they weren't? Immune to mosquitoes or prepared to fight ex-slaves who had nothing left to lose. The Haitians had already kicked out the Spanish and British. Now they had to deal with France, again. Leaders like Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture weren't warlords. They were former slaves with military genius, local backing, and serious grudges. France showed up expecting a quick win. Instead, they got hit by guerrilla warfare, scorched earth tactics, and yellow fever. Whole regiments vanished in weeks. The climate alone killed thousands. The Haitians took care of the rest. The French never adapted. They marched in tight European lines through humid plantations and dense forests. They carried too much gear and too little water. Some units couldn't even find their supply drop. Meanwhile, the Haitians attacked from behind trees, poisoned wells, and vanished before the French even knew what direction to aim. Toussaint was captured in 1802 and sent to France, where he died in prison. But the French didn't break the movement, they just made it matter. Dessalines picked up the fight. He wasn't interested in compromise. His plan was simple: no more colonizers, no more chains. The final blow came in late 1803 at the Battle of Vertières. French troops, sick and starving, fell apart. By January 1804, France surrendered. Haiti became the first free black republic in the world. France lost a colony, tens of thousands of soldiers, and a shot at empire in the Americas. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the US shortly after. He didn't have the money or the manpower to hold it anymore. The Haitians didn't have cannons, cavalry, or clean uniforms. What they had was firepower born from fury. France came to teach a lesson. Instead, it got schooled in everything it never learned about the people it tried to enslave. If revenge had a nation, it was Haiti. Boer Guerrillas versus British firepower. By 1899, the British Empire had perfected the art of showing up uninvited. This time, it was South Africa. Gold had been found in Boer territory, and Britain wanted a peace. Problem was, the Boers weren't interested in handing it over. They also weren't interested in playing by empire rule. The Boers were farmers, Dutch-descended settlers with beards, horses, and zero patience for foreign flags. Britain sent 400,000 troops to handle the situation. The Boers had around 88,000 fighters total. If this were a boxing match, it'd be over in one round. But guerrilla war doesn't care about weight class. The Boers didn't line up for battles. They hit supply trains, derailed railroads, ambushed patrols, and vanished into the hills. They rode fast, struck faster, and didn't stick around to shake hands. It drove the British mad. By 1900, Britain had taken the Boer capitals. Victory, right? Not even close. The Boers just melted into the countryside and kept shooting. So Britain changed tactics. They started burning farms, taking prisoners, and building camps to cut off support. Those camps became infamous. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in them, most from disease and starvation. The war dragged on for 3 brutal years. The British eventually forced a surrender in 1902, but it was a hollow win. They lost 22,000 soldiers. They spent millions. The press back home turned bitter. The victory left a sour taste that never quite faded. The Boers lost in the end, but they humiliated a global power in the process. It took the largest army Britain had ever sent overseas to stop some cattle herders with outdated rifles. Empire came for gold. It left with a body count, bad press, and a new understanding of what happens when you corner people on their own land. They weren't rebels. They were farmers with aim. Finland versus the Soviet Union. In late 1939, the Soviet Union decided Finland looked too independent. Stalin wanted more territory and a buffer zone, so he sent in 400,000 troops. Finland had 300,000, but only on paper. Most of them were farmers, shopkeepers, and ski instructors with old rifles and colder blood than the snow they fought on. The Soviets expected a 2-week campaign. It lasted over 3 months. The Red Army rolled in with tanks, planes, and sheer numbers. Finland responded by vanishing into the woods and turning winter into a weapon. Soldiers wore white camo, moved on skis, and attacked at night. They used Molotov cocktails to torch tanks and snipers to pick off officers. One Finnish sniper, Simo Heija, killed over 500 Soviets by himself, without a scope. They called him the White Death. He called it a good season. Soviet tanks froze, troops starved, entire divisions got lost in forests they never trained to fight in, maps were useless, logistics collapsed, Soviet generals got shot by their own side for incompetence. Stalin had purged most of his top commanders before the war even started, so what was left wasn't brilliant, it was expendable. The Finns didn't expect to win, they just refused to lose. They built roadblocks from trees, booby-trapped trails, and made every ambush count. The Red Army suffered over 300,000 casualties. Finland lost 25,000 but kept its government, its pride, and most of its land. Eventually, the Soviets forced a peace treaty. Finland had to give up some territory, but it kept its independence. Barely, but it survived. The Soviets got their buffer zone. What they didn't get was respect. The Winter War became one of the most embarrassing chapters in Soviet military history. The Red Army had rolled in expecting surrender. Instead, it got frostbite, pine needles, and a country that just wouldn't fall. Finland didn't win by overpowering the enemy. It won by outlasting it and making every step of the invasion feel like a very bad idea.